I don't need you to be whole. I'll protect my child, with or without you.
The scene was brutal. A husband, his wife in labor, and the mistress waiting inside. The door shut, leaving Eleanor alone in the storm. It was the abyss, the end of everything, or so it seemed, because a $20 million secret was about to rewrite that story. And what was rock bottom for Eleanor would become, by an act of justice, the beginning of the end for Blake. Before the snowstorm, there was sunshine. Before the door slammed in the darkness, there were gala dinners with perfectly rehearsed smiles in their Beacon Hill home. To the world, Eleanor and Blake were Boston's golden couple. His power was visible, loud. Hers was silent, almost invisible, and infinitely more dangerous. Blake didn't want a partner. He wanted a final masterpiece for his collection. There was the incident with the painting. A small landscape that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother. A piece full of memory and affection. One afternoon she came home to find it replaced by an immense abstract canvas, expensive and cold. "It's an investment piece, darling," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It fits our image better." He wasn't just decorating a wall. He was curating his own life, editing out the parts of her that didn't fit into his narrative of success. And Eleanor played her part with studied perfection. Blake saw submission in her calm gaze. A more observant person would have seen strategy. He mistook her silence for consent, her patience for passivity. It was the fundamental mistake that would seal his fate. The pregnancy was, for Blake, the coronation, the heir to his empire. He would touch Eleanor's belly not with the tenderness of a father, but with the pride of a king. He believed he had built the perfect gilded cage, safe and secure. It never occurred to him the frightening truth. Eleanor was never in the cage. She was the storm itself, patiently waiting for the moment to break. The door shut with the finality of a death sentence. For an instant, the only sound was the howling of the wind. Eleanor remained there, kneeling in the snow, when a contraction hit her, a white-hot fire that stole her breath. His words still echoed in her mind, colder than the blizzard itself. "You are nothing without me, Eleanor." "Absolutely nothing." She lifted her gaze to the window and saw the silhouette of Savannah, watching with a cold curiosity. That indifferent look was the confirmation that she was no longer a rival, but a problem that had been solved. And it was in this abyss of humiliation that a new fear, more primal and powerful than her own pain, pierced through her. The cold. Not the cold on her skin, but the cold that could reach her unborn daughter. The image of her baby, vulnerable, entering this cold and hostile world, was the breaking point. Desperation instantly transformed into a protective fury. The pain of childbirth, the betrayal, the humiliation, it all became secondary. Only one truth mattered. She had to survive for her daughter. Every step away from that house was an act of war. She stood up, her body heavy, her heart an anvil of ice. As she walked down the deserted street, she touched the phoenix brooch beneath her coat. Blake and Savannah thought they were watching the end of the show, but Eleanor knew, with the clarity of a silent promise made to her daughter, that they had merely witnessed the raising of the curtain. The blizzard was relentless, turning the street into a merciless white blur. Eleanor, her coat heavy with snow and her body trembling, desperately tried to unlock her phone with frozen fingers. Another contraction hit her, a wave of fire that made her double over, and the device slipped from her hand, disappearing into the whiteness. It was a moment of pure desperation. There, in the heart of a city of millions, surrounded by the wealth she once called her own, she was completely alone and invisible. That's when the headlights of an old sedan cut through the storm. The car slowed, almost stopping. At the wheel, a man named Sal, with a face weathered by long nights of work, watched her. His first instinct was to drive on. You don't stop for strangers in the middle of a Boston blizzard. But then he saw it. He saw the way she fought to stand up straight after the wave of pain, the way she planted her feet on the ice, the stubbornness in her chin held high against the wind. He didn't see a woman asking for help. He saw a woman refusing to be defeated, and that made him stop. "Hospital, right?" he asked, his calm voice a refuge in the midst of the chaos. Eleanor just nodded, climbing into the blessed warmth of the car. The drive was made in respectful silence. Sal didn't ask questions she wouldn't have been able to answer. He just turned the heat to full blast and navigated the slippery streets with a skill that spoke of decades behind the wheel. When they arrived at the emergency entrance, he waited until Eleanor was safely within the range of the automatic doors. When she, with a trembling hand, held out a handful of crumpled bills, he gently refused them with a soft gesture. "Keep it. You're going to need it," he said. He looked at her for a moment, his gaze seeing more than she could imagine. "My own daughter. She's a fighter just like you, full of fire. You go in there and be a fighter for that baby." Sal drove away, disappearing into the curtain of snow. His words, however, remained. It wasn't an act of charity. It was an act of recognition. A complete stranger saw her for who she truly was, a force of nature. That recognition was the fuel she would use to face what came next. The automatic doors of the hospital slid open, and Eleanor was swallowed by a different kind of chaos. Fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, a cacophony of beeps and hurried voices. She was anonymous in the crowd, just another body in pain. A nurse with a name tag that read Mags approached her with impatient efficiency. That's when a contraction, more powerful than all the others, hit her. She didn't scream. She gritted her teeth and dove into the pain. When she opened her eyes, Mags's expression had changed. The impatience was gone, replaced by a silent respect. The veteran nurse had just witnessed the discipline of a warrior. From that moment on, Mags became her pillar. The hours dragged on until the moment arrived. "It's time, Eleanor. It's time to fight," Mags said, holding her hand. And at the peak of the pain, with the world reduced to that single instant, Blake's face flashed in her mind, smiling with contempt. "You are nothing without me." The sentence echoed, a last-ditch attempt by his ghost to break her. And there, suspended between the pain of the past and the promise of the future, Eleanor realized she had a choice to make. It wasn't just about pushing. It was about deciding where the strength would come from. She could give birth with the strength of an abandoned woman, or she could give birth with the fury of a queen about to take her throne. Blake's face in her mind was the last thing Eleanor allowed to haunt her. She accepted the challenge. The pain of the next contraction was a wave of power. She would not give birth as an abandoned woman, but as a queen forging her crown in fire. She wasn't just bringing her daughter into the world, she was exorcising Blake's shadow from her life forever. A final cry, and then the sharp, strong cry of her daughter. Mags placed her in her arms. Aurora, the dawn. As she gazed at the shape of Aurora's eyes, she saw an unmistakable trace of her grandmother, and with it, the memory of the most important lesson she had ever learned. The image took her to her grandmother's library years before, the smell of old books and the chessboard. "Never rush to capture a pawn, Eleanor," her grandmother said. "The most devastating victory is the one the enemy never sees coming." It was then that she revealed the $20 million trust fund. Men like Blake are afraid of women who need nothing. This money isn't a gift, it's a weapon. She explained the Blizzard Protocol, the legal and financial emergency button. "When the time comes," her grandmother said, handing her the phoenix brooch, "be reborn from the ashes he himself creates." The flashback dissipated. Eleanor looked at Aurora, sleeping in her arms. The silent promise she made to her daughter now had a plan of action. With a surprising calm, she asked Mags for the phone. Dialing from memory, she waited. "Walter," she said, and her voice was her grandmother's, a CEO's, a queen's. "It's Eleanor." She paused, looking at her daughter's serene face. "It's happened. Activate the Blizzard Protocol. Full lockdown. No exceptions." As she hung up the phone, the hand that held it trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the magnitude of the force she had just unleashed. In that moment, the part of her heart that had once loved Blake was locked away, and the key thrown out. The warrior could not afford a divided heart. In the sacred silence of the hospital room, Eleanor cradled her daughter, feeling the tiny, infinite weight of the future in her arms. Every breath Aurora took was a promise. Across the city, in the Beacon Hill house that was no longer his, Blake celebrated the exact opposite, a future free of promises, a toast to the glorious void he had created. The pop of a Dom Perignon cork echoed through the living room, a sharp sound of victory. The fire danced in the hearth, casting golden reflections on the walls where expensive paintings disguised the lack of human warmth. Blake filled 2 crystal flutes, handing one to Savannah, who was dramatically reclined on the sofa, wearing a silk robe that had once belonged to Eleanor. "To a new beginning," Savannah said, her voice a satisfied purr. "No baggage, no drama, and a lot more closet space." Blake laughed, a guttural sound of pure self-satisfaction. He walked to the window, watching the blizzard punish the city. "She hated the cold," he said, more to himself than to Savannah. "Always complained. Said the winter made her feel trapped." He turned, a smug glint in his eyes. "Some people are anchors, Savannah. Beautiful, expensive anchors, sure, but they still keep you stuck in the same port. They don't understand that a real yacht needs open water to sail. I finally cut the rope." He sat beside her, the predator relaxing after a successful hunt. "Now, to celebrate our freedom," he said, grabbing his laptop. "A new beginning deserves an upgrade." He opened the website of the same luxury jeweler where, a year earlier, he had bought Eleanor a delicate sapphire necklace, a family heirloom, she had said. He found the same design but ignored it, clicking on a larger, flashier version studded with diamonds. A replacement, not a choice. An upgrade. Sapphires were for a wife, he muttered with disdain. Diamonds are for a celebration. With the confidence of a man for whom money is just an abstraction, he typed the 16 digits of his American Express Centurion card. He clicked Confirm Purchase, already picturing the look of admiration on Savannah's face. The page loaded. And then, the words in red, cold, and impersonal. "Payment declined. Please contact your financial institution." Blake blinked. And then, a forced laugh. "Unbelievable," he exclaimed, closing the laptop a little harder than necessary. "It must be the anti-fraud system. Happens all the time when you move 7 figures. Some stupid computer somewhere thinks the card's been stolen. Amateurs." He stood up, projecting an aura of absolute control to disguise the sudden pang of irritation. "I'll sort it out with a call tomorrow." But the seed of doubt, tiny and cold, had been planted. To reassert his power, more for himself than for her, he picked up his phone. "Let's do it the old-fashioned way, then." He opened his banking app, the familiarity of the interface calming him. He navigated to the joint account, the expense fund he so generously maintained. His fingers swiped across the screen with the certainty of a king. He expected to see the usual 6 figures. The number that stared back at him was 0.0, the 0, the symbol of nothing, the very same nothing he, hours earlier, had said Eleanor was without him. The air seemed to thicken. The crackling of the fire suddenly sounded distant. He refreshed the page. Once, twice, 3 times. The number remained, mocking and absolute. The smile froze on his face. The champagne flute in his hand suddenly felt heavy, the golden liquid losing all its sparkle. For the first time in his adult life, Blake looked at his own hands. The hands that built, that signed, that controlled everything, and felt no power. He felt the void. While Blake, miles away, stared at the digital void of a 0 on his screen, Eleanor was commanding an army of zeros to the right. The transition in her reality was abrupt and total. She was no longer in a public hospital bed, but in the presidential suite of the Ritz-Carlton, with panoramic windows displaying the Boston Common covered in a white, untouched blanket of snow. The suite wasn't a refuge. It was a command center. On the mahogany coffee table, there were no luxury magazines, but property deeds, financial statements, and the floor plan of the Beacon Hill house. The only sound, besides the crackling fireplace, was the soft clicking of laptop keyboards and the professional murmur of a conference call. Eleanor, seated in an ivory velvet armchair, was the calm center of this hurricane. Inside, she didn't feel the adrenaline of revenge. She felt a cold clarity, the absence of fear. It was the first time in years she wasn't reacting to Blake's actions, but forcing him to react to hers. It was the feeling, she realized, of true freedom. Aurora slept peacefully in a designer bassinet beside her. Near the door, her new head of security stood in silence. And on the large television screen, 3 of Boston's most expensive lawyers listened intently. "Freeze everything that has his signature remotely connected to my funds." "What's the status on the Beacon Hill house?" she asked, as she instinctively adjusted Aurora's blanket. "Our legal team filed the motion for exclusive possession of the property first thing this morning, citing his actions last night as justification," Walter replied from the screen. "A process server is all ready with the order in hand and is en route to serve him notice. From the moment of service, he will have 60 minutes to collect his personal belongings. The team to change the locks is scheduled for 3 p.m., with or without his cooperation." "Excellent. And the restraining order? I want him at least 100 yards from me and my daughter." Back at the house that was no longer his, Blake was shifting from shock to a blind rage. His mind, an engine of arrogance, worked furiously to find an explanation that kept him in control. "She blocked a joint account to scare me?" he snarled, more to himself than to Savannah, who watched him with a hidden anxiety. "She thinks she can throw a tantrum and I'll come running back? Pathetic." "Blake, are you sure that's all it is?" Savannah asked, her voice a little less confident than before. "And your card?" "It's a system error," he barked. "It's a maneuver on her part, a cry for attention from a woman who doesn't know how to lose." The conclusion calmed him, because it placed him back at the center of power, as the man who had to deal with a hysterical ex-wife. He grabbed his car keys, his face a mask of misguided determination. "Where are you going?" "To the hospital," Blake said, his voice full of a confidence the audience now knew was tragic. "I'm going to put an end to this nonsense right now." He left, marching toward a confrontation with a woman who was no longer there. He was 3 moves behind, racing to a battle that had already been lost, while the Queen, from her tower of glass and steel, watched the snow fall and planned the next 10 moves. Blake marched into the hospital with the certainty of a man who owns the world. As he passed the waiting room, he felt the stares. A man whispered to his wife, pointing discreetly, "Blake Vance." The name was in the society columns. He ignored it, used to being the center of attention, and went straight to the maternity ward. "I'm here to see my wife, Eleanor Vance," he announced to the nurse. The woman looked at her computer, impassive. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't have any patient by that name registered." Blake forced a laugh. "Of course you do. She was admitted tonight." He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial tone. "Look, I know she might be upset, but—" "Sir," the nurse cut him off, her voice firm. "Due to patient privacy laws, I cannot provide any further information." The wall of bureaucracy was impenetrable. His anger rose, impotent. Frustrated, he returned to the silence of his car. The engine hummed, a sound of power that no longer translated to the outside world. As he drove aimlessly through the snow-covered streets, his mind was at work, constructing a narrative that would protect him. "This is her fault," he thought. "Emotional instability because of the pregnancy. She's trying to create drama, to punish me. She'll regret it when she realizes she can't live without me." He clung to this idea, that he was still the center of her universe, and this was just an erratic orbit. He called Eleanor's father, hoping to find an ally. The call was brutally short. He didn't hear an apology, but a torrent of rage that called him a monster before hanging up in his face. Now, the icy confusion began to fight against the wall of his arrogance. There was only one place left: his home, his castle. He parked and walked up the steps, seeking the familiar comfort of metal in his hand. He inserted the key into the lock, and felt the resistance. The block. It wasn't a jammed door. It was an absolute metallic denial. He pulled the key out, looked at it as if it were an alien object, and tried again. Nothing. The sound of scraping metal was the sound of his authority being sanded down to dust. It was in that moment that the truth of the situation began to take shape. Blake had always built his life like an imposing, perfect sandcastle. What he never understood was that the beach, the sand, the tide itself, had always belonged to Eleanor. As he stood there, a king exiled from his own doorstep, an official car pulled up to the curb. A county sheriff stepped out. "Blake Vance?" he asked. Blake, stunned, could only nod. The sheriff then held out a large brown envelope, and the ground, which was already quicksand, began to swallow him whole. Blake took the envelope, his mind still trying to process the key that didn't work. The sheriff, impassive, said only, "You've been served, sir," and walked away, leaving Blake alone with the document. He tore it open. The words leaped off the page. Order of exclusive possession. Immediate vacation. Blake Vance. And he laughed. A sharp, broken sound of pure disbelief. "This is absurd. My lawyers will turn this to dust." He marched toward the sheriff, who was waiting with the calm of a man used to dealing with deposed kings. Blake brandished the paper. "This is a mistake. This house is mine." The sheriff didn't even blink at his fury. The officer's indifference was a blow in itself. "Sir," he said, his voice a monotone that disarmed all of Blake's anger. "According to the documentation, this property has always been the sole asset of the Aurora Vance Trust. Us as the administrator, Ms. Eleanor Vance has been granted exclusive and immediate use of the premises. The name, Aurora Vance. It wasn't just a legal revelation, it was a personal stab. Eleanor hadn't just used her grandmother's money. She had used their own daughter's name as the flag for her new nation, a nation from which he was permanently exiled. Eleanor's grandmother had a golden rule: never let a man own the roof over your head. Blake stood paralyzed, the paper trembling in his hand. The pieces began to click into place, forming a monstrous picture. And as if summoned by his worst nightmares, a white moving truck turned the corner slowly. The hiss of its air brakes was a final sigh for the life he knew. It was no longer a piece of paper. It was real. It was happening. He looked from the document to the locked door, and then to the truck. The fury gave way to a cold, deep terror. A thought, previously impossible, now screamed in his mind. If the house wasn't his, what else was a lie? Standing on the snow-covered sidewalk, with the eviction notice in one hand and the useless key in his pocket, Blake's mind raced, searching for solid ground. The house was gone, but he still had his car. The black Porsche Taycan parked a few yards away was more than a vehicle. It was his mobile sanctuary of power. He marched to the car, fury giving him purpose. He needed to get out of there, go to his office, his real throne, and start fighting back. He unlocked the car, sat in the soft leather seat, and pressed the start button. The familiar glow of the dashboard screens lit up, but the engine gave no sign of life. Instead of the silent hum of the electric motor, a message appeared on the main screen in cold white letters. Lease agreement terminated. Vehicle disabled. He pressed the button again, harder. Nothing. The car was dead. Remotely deactivated. It was a violation, a technological castration. Eleanor hadn't just taken the car. She had turned it into a tomb of metal and glass around him. Blake got out of the vehicle, slamming the door with a force that echoed on the quiet street. Now, he was truly on foot. Humiliated. That's when he called an Uber. The indignity of having to wait on his own sidewalk for an anonymous car ate away at him. He headed to the glass and steel skyscraper he believed he still commanded. In the lobby, the electronic turnstile flashed red. Access denied. The security guard approached, uncomfortable. "There must be a mistake," Blake said. "Check again. My name is Blake Vance. I know who you are, Mr. Vance. But the directive is from the new administration. Your access has been revoked." "New administration? I am the administration," he snarled. Not according to my list, sir. Now standing on a cold corner in downtown Boston, the real panic began to set in. He clung to his phone, his last fortress, his personal investment portfolio, the real money, the fruit of his genius. He opened his luxury brokerage app. The screen froze. Account under administrative review. Eleanor's grandmother, anticipating the arrogance of a man who thinks he's a financial genius, had ensured that his independent brokerage was one where the family fund had the power of a final auditor. It was the most elegant trap of all. Defeated, he went to meet Savannah at a café. He saw her through the glass before he entered, an image of carefree elegance. When he sat down, his coat rumpled, his hair a mess, he saw a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. He tried to project control, telling the story of a bureaucratic nightmare, a hostile maneuver by Eleanor. Savannah listened with the patience of an appraiser, stirring her coffee. She wasn't listening to the excuses. She was reading the balance sheet of his future. "So, you don't have access to any money right now?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "It's temporary. Aren't you listening to me? My lawyers will take care of it," he said, his voice rising. "I am listening," she replied, and the coldness in her eyes was absolute. "I'm listening to a man who was kicked out of his house and had his assets frozen." Deep down, she was a brilliant student of his own philosophy. Hadn't he taught her about anchors and the courage to cut the rope? Blake's yacht was sinking, and Savannah had no intention of going down with it. She picked up her purse. "Blake, I'm sorry," she said, her voice a scalpel of indifference. "But this isn't what I signed up for." "You're leaving me?" he begged, his voice breaking. She looked at him as if he were a stranger. "I didn't get involved with you to end up homeless." Savannah stood up, took a $50 bill from her wallet, and placed it on the table. "For your coffee." The final act of humiliation, and walked out without looking back. Blake was left alone, the smell of expensive coffee in the air. No house, no company, no car, no money, no mistress. The cold from the street, which his expensive coat used to block, now seemed to have settled in his soul. He was the exact nothing he had thrown out into the snow, and amidst the total ruin of his identity, a single thought, a last desperate option, emerged in his mind. He had to find Eleanor. Days passed, which for Blake felt like an eternity of humiliation. He was now a ghost in his own city, sleeping on an old colleague's sofa, who looked at him with a mixture of pity and discomfort. After dozens of calls, a former acquaintance of the couple finally relented, hastily telling him the name of a café in the Prudential Center that Eleanor now frequented. With the last of his money in his pocket, he went. Upon entering the warm, sophisticated atmosphere, he felt immediately out of place. His coat was rumpled, he was unshaven, his eyes were hollow from sleepless nights. And then, he saw her, and the air seemed to leave his lungs. Seated near a window with a view of the snow-covered city, Eleanor was a vision of serenity that hit him like a wave. This wasn't the same woman. She wore a simple blue cashmere dress. Her hair was slightly shorter, in a cut that accentuated the strength of her face. There was a calmness in her shoulders, the posture of someone who occupies her space in the world without apology. Beside her, Aurora slept in a pristine stroller, a small oasis of peace. That scene wasn't just an image of happiness. It was a verdict. It was the living proof of the life he had stupidly thrown away. With his heart pounding a beat of panic and desperation, he approached the table. "Eleanor?" he said, and his own voice sounded strange, hoarse. She looked up. There was no shock, no anger, just a vague recognition, her eyes registering him for an instant before becoming completely neutral. She did not invite him to sit. He remained standing, a beggar before royalty. "I'm sorry," he began, the words spilling out in a confusing, pathetic torrent. "I know I messed up. I was an idiot, a monster, but I wasn't thinking straight. Savannah, she manipulated me. She has this way of—" He noticed the next table glance over and instinctively lowered his voice. shame now mixing with his agony. I lost everything, Eleanor. The house, the money, that was all mine. It was ours. I built that. And now I have nothing. Nothing. He paused, waiting for a reaction. None came. Her silence was a void that forced him to keep talking, to fill it with more and more of his desperation. Remember our trip to Nantucket? At the lighthouse? We were happy. I know we were. We can have that back. He leaned in, his voice a pleading whisper. Think of her. Of our daughter, Aurora. She needs a father. I need you both. I swear I'll be the man you always deserved. He spoke for minutes, emptying his soul at her table. And the entire time, Eleanor remained impassive. In her mind, a final thought formed. Not with anger, but with the clarity of a sky after a storm. The man I loved no longer exists. This is just his ghost, haunting himself. Her gaze was that of a geologist examining a rock. She saw the layers, the faults, the pressure that had broken him, but she felt nothing. He was no longer a person to her. He was a case study. When the flow of his words finally dried up, he stared at her, his face contorted in a silent plea. Instead of answering, Eleanor performed her ritual of departure. She placed her cup on the saucer. She folded her linen napkin. With a discreet nod, she called the waiter. The bill arrived. She took a black metal card from her purse. As she signed it, she added an extremely generous tip, a casual gesture of abundance that was crueler than any insult. She stood up, adjusting Aurora's stroller. Eleanor, he whispered. She finally turned to him, her voice as neutral as the winter sky. You didn't banish me to an empire, Blake. You just freed me to claim what was always mine. For that, and only for that, I thank you. She turned and pushed the stroller toward the exit, her steps calm and measured. Blake stood there, watching her disappear. He wasn't destroyed by a storm of fury. He was erased by a calm. The deposed king, left alone in a café, with the ghost of a life he was no longer worthy of haunting. 6 months later, the afternoon Boston sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, flooding a penthouse that seemed to float over the harbor. The apartment was open, minimalist, awash in light. It was a space that didn't show off wealth, but breathed freedom. In the center of the room, on a soft rug, Eleanor was playing with Aurora. Now, with rosy cheeks and a curious babble, the baby was trying to crawl, collapsing in a fit of giggles with each attempt. Eleanor watched her with a pure joy, a feeling she didn't know existed in her previous life. The doorbell chimed softly. It was Walter, her family's advisor, who was now her main counsel. He entered, not with the formality of an employee, but with the warmth of an old friend. The acquisition was finalized this morning, he said, handing her a tablet. Your offer was aggressive, but precise. Congratulations, Eleanor. She scrolled through the numbers, her gaze quick and analytical. They underestimated our position. That was their mistake, she replied. Thank you, Walter, for everything. He looked at her, his gaze shifting from her to the baby. The money and the business we manage. But tell me, how are you really? Eleanor followed his gaze to Aurora, and a genuine smile lit up her face. For the first time in my life, Walter, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. After he left, she returned to the rug. Her grandmother's empire, now under her command, was thriving. But the real success was there, on that floor, in the freedom to spend an entire afternoon just watching her daughter discover the world. For true independence, Eleanor finally understood, was not an inheritance kept in a vault. It was an action. It wasn't simply having power, but the will to use it to demolish a prison and build a fortress around what mattered most. Later, with Aurora sleeping in her arms, Eleanor went to the window, watching the boats glide across the calm harbor water. For an instant, she remembered the other view, of the snow falling in the darkness, the feeling of the biting cold. She felt no pain, only the immense distance between the woman she was and the woman she had become. She smiled, a smile of peace finally achieved. She was home. She was safe. She was free. Eleanor smiles, holding Aurora by the window, looking toward the future. The uplifting music swells to its peak and begins to fade gently, like the end credits of a movie. And then, the sharp, formal sound of an electronic doorbell cuts through the piece. Surprised, Eleanor turns from the window. She's not expecting anyone. With Aurora still secure in her arms, she walks to the video intercom. On the screen, a woman she doesn't recognize. Hair pulled back in a severe bun, an expensive pantsuit, a leather briefcase in her hand, and a look that revealed absolutely nothing. A lawyer, Eleanor thought. A chill ran down her spine. Lawyers don't show up unannounced. Yes? She said through the intercom, her voice suddenly cautious. Ms. Eleanor Vance? The woman's voice was as polished as glass. My name is Catherine Shaw. I'm with Shaw and Associates. I need a moment of your time for an urgent and private matter. Eleanor hesitated. Her new life was built on the premise of security, of impenetrable barriers. But curiosity, and a pang of her old fighting instinct, made her press the button. Come up. She opened the door before the lawyer arrived. She stood there with Aurora in her arms, a queen at the entrance to her castle. Catherine Shaw stepped out of the elevator and walked down the hall, her heels echoing on the marble. Her eyes weren't on Eleanor, but were scanning the apartment, the view, the art on the walls, calculating the value of it all. Thank you for seeing me, Ms. Vance, she said, stopping at a respectful distance. If this is about Mr. Vance, I believe your lawyers have already received all of our correspondence. The matter is closed, Eleanor said, her voice firm. The matter of your divorce, yes, Catherine corrected, opening her briefcase with deliberate calm. This, however, is a new matter. I am here on behalf of my client, Ms. Savannah Miller. The name, an unwanted ghost. Eleanor felt her grip on Aurora tighten. Ms. Miller has, and will ever have, nothing to discuss with me. My client believes she does, the lawyer continued, unfazed, and the law agrees. I am here to serve you this formal notice. Ms. Miller is filing a paternity suit and a petition for child support against Mr. Vance. Eleanor almost laughed. The arrogance of the gesture. Counselor, Blake Vance is a legally insolvent man. He doesn't have a penny. This suit is pointless. Catherine Shaw looked up from her papers, and for the first time, Eleanor saw a glint of steel in her eyes, a reflection of her own. We're not interested in what Mr. Vance has. We're interested in what he had. She removed the legal document. The suit aims to establish the right to financial support for the child she is expecting, specifically from the assets that Mr. Vance possessed and managed, prior to the recent and, as we will argue, fraudulent mass transfer to your trust fund. The blow. It wasn't about Blake. It was about her. Catherine Shaw then removed a second paper from her briefcase, a color copy, and placed it on the coffee table. It was the grainy image of an ultrasound. The child, a boy, is due in 3 months, the lawyer said, her voice now a scalpel. We will argue that this child is entitled to the same lifestyle and financial security as the born heiress, Ms. Aurora Vance. Eleanor picked up the paper, and the world seemed to go silent. She didn't just see the image of a fetus. She saw the ghost of Blake, a legacy of his betrayal that she could never erase, a blood tie that would forever link her daughter, Aurora, to the woman who helped destroy her family. The peace she had felt moments before was now a distant memory, a cruel joke. We expect to hear from your attorneys within the week, Catherine Shaw concluded. She turned and left, leaving the documents on the table like time bombs. Eleanor stood in the middle of her sunlit room, holding the image of her enemy's son. The fortress she had built to protect her daughter now had a new gate, one that she could never truly close. The war she thought she had won, in truth, was just beginning. And so, the fortress that Eleanor built to protect one daughter is confronted by the existence of another child. This leaves us with an impossible question. The woman who was born on that snowy night now has 2 paths to follow. Should the merciless queen who destroyed Blake be the same one to deal with Savannah, protecting her empire at all costs? Or should the mother, who would do anything for a child, Recognize the innocence of another, even if it is the living legacy of her greatest pain? Justice or compassion? We want to know your verdict. Leave your theory about what she should do in the comments below. The answer to that question will be told in part 2 of this saga. To not miss what happens next, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications.